The telephone rang in the concrete bunker 50 feet below Berlin on April 30th, 1945. SS Sergeant Rochus Misch answered it with his practiced efficiency, connecting the call through the switchboard he'd operated for years. Soviet artillery shells exploded somewhere above, shaking dust from the reinforced ceiling. Misch had been answering Hitler's phone since 1940, but this call would be one of his last. In a few hours, the man he called the boss, the man he'd lived beside for 5 years, the man whose food he'd tasted for poison, whose schedule he'd guarded, whose visitors he'd announced, would be dead by his own hand. Rochus Misch would be one of the last people to see Adolf Hitler alive, one of the final witnesses to the end of the Third Reich. He would watch as Hitler's body was carried past him, wrapped in a blanket, shoes sticking out of one end. He would remain at his post in what he called the coffin of concrete for 2 more days after Hitler's death, answering phones for Joseph Goebbels until the Soviets captured Berlin. Then he would spend 9 years in Soviet prison camps before returning to Berlin, where he would live in the same working-class house until his death in 2013 at age 96. Throughout those decades, Misch never apologized for his service to history's most evil man. He called Hitler a wonderful boss and insisted to his final days that the Führer was no monster. This is the story of Hitler's shadow, the ordinary man who stood beside extraordinary evil for 5 years and never quite understood, or never quite admitted, what that meant. Rochus Misch was born on July 29, 1917, in Alt-Schalkowitz, a tiny village in Silesia that is now part of Poland. His childhood was marked by loss. Orphaned at an early age, he was raised by his grandfather, who pulled him out of school after 8 years, despite the school director's objections. The grandfather believed Rochus needed to learn a trade, rather than waste time with books. Misch became an apprentice painter and decorator, working with his hands, learning a practical skill that might have defined his entire life if history had not intervened. In 1935, after completing his apprenticeship, Misch attended the Master's School for Fine Arts in Cologne for 6 months, then returned to Hoyerswerda to continue his training. He met Gerda, his future wife, in July 1938. They would marry on New Year's Eve 1942, in the middle of a war that would consume the next 3 years of Misch's life and separate them for long periods. But in 1937, before marriage and war, Misch received a call-up notice for military service. He made a decision that would change everything. Rather than join the Wehrmacht, the regular German army, Misch volunteered for the SS Verfügungstruppe, the predecessor to the Waffen-SS. His reasoning was simple and apolitical. The SS didn't require Reich's Arbeitsdienst, the mandatory labor service expected of Wehrmacht recruits. It was a matter of convenience, not ideology. Misch later insisted he had no particular Nazi beliefs when he joined. He saw the SS as a counterweight to communism, which had gained popularity in Germany after World War I and seemed threatening given the bloody Russian Revolution and Stalin's rise to power. The SS offered structure, discipline, and a sense of purpose to a young man who had lost his parents and found himself adrift in an uncertain Germany. Along with 11 other recruits, Misch was selected for an elite unit, the Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, originally founded as the Führer's personal bodyguard. The selection changed Misch's life trajectory completely. In September 1939, when Germany invaded Poland, Misch went to war with the Leibstandarte. He was part of a small group of Germans attempting to negotiate the surrender of Polish troops at a fortress near Warsaw, when the situation went catastrophically wrong. Misch was shot and nearly killed, suffering serious wounds that sent him back to Germany for extended recovery. It was during this recovery period, as he healed from injuries that might have ended his military career, that Misch received an unexpected summons. In May 1940, he was invited to join Hitler's personal staff, the Führer Begleitkommando, or Führer Escort Command. He would be one of 2 SS men serving as Hitler's bodyguards and general assistants, responsible for everything from answering telephones to greeting dignitaries to tasting Hitler's food for poison. Misch's duties were mundane yet intimate. He lived between Hitler's apartments in the new Reich Chancellery in Berlin and maintained a home in a working-class Berlin neighborhood that he would keep until his death 73 years later. He accompanied Hitler almost everywhere, to the Berghof, Hitler's Alpine retreat in Berchtesgaden, to the Wolfslair, the Führer's forward headquarters in East Prussia, to military conferences and diplomatic meetings. He watched as Eva Braun organized parties on the Berghof Terrace. He observed Heinrich Himmler, architect of the Holocaust, and Albert Speer, Hitler's architect and armaments minister, as they came and went. He monitored telephone conversations. He was present on July 20, 1944, when reports came in of the assassination attempt at the Wolfslayer, monitoring calls from Berlin to East Prussia as the conspiracy collapsed. He was, in historian Roger Morehouse's phrase, as close to being a fly on the wall as one could get in Hitler's inner sanctum. Yet Misch insisted throughout his life that he remained ignorant of the Holocaust and the full scale of Nazi crimes. In a 2005 interview with the Associated Press, he stated emphatically that Hitler never discussed the final solution in his presence. He said, "That was never a topic. Never." He acknowledged knowing about concentration camps. He mentioned Dachau specifically, but claimed he had no idea of the scale of murder being committed. He said it wasn't part of our conversations. This claim is difficult to evaluate. Misch was not a high-ranking officer privy to policy discussions. His role was operational and protective rather than political. It's possible, though perhaps not probable, that Hitler truly never discussed genocide in front of his telephone operator and bodyguard. But it's also possible that Misch, like many Germans of his generation, found it convenient to claim ignorance after the war ended and the full horror of Nazi crimes became undeniable.
What Misch did witness and described in detail in his 2008 memoir Der letzte Zeuge, The Last Witness, was Hitler the man rather than Hitler the historical monster. Misch saw a boss who was extremely unpretentious, who maintained regular hours when possible, who showed kindness to his staff. He was a wonderful boss, Misch told the AP in 2005. I lived with him for 5 years. We were the closest people who worked with him. We were always there. Hitler was never without us day and night. This proximity created a relationship that Misch described with genuine affection. He affectionately called Hitler the boss throughout his life, speaking of him not as history's great villain, but as an employer who treated him well, a man whose daily routines and personal habits Misch knew better than almost anyone. The intimacy of this relationship raises uncomfortable questions. How could someone spend 5 years in close proximity to Adolf Hitler and emerge with positive memories? Part of the answer lies in Misch's limited perspective. He saw Hitler at meals, in meetings, during downtime at the Berghof. He didn't see the orders being given for mass murder. He didn't witness the gas chambers or the killing fields of the Eastern Front. He saw the private man who liked his German shepherd Blondie, who married Eva Braun in a brief ceremony, who maintained the routines of a head of state. Misch's Hitler was the man who existed in the spaces between the atrocities, the man who needed someone to answer his phones and taste his food. But another part of the answer is more troubling. Misch represented a particular type of German complicity, not the ideological zealot or the sadistic camp guard, but the ordinary person who served the regime competently without asking difficult questions. In the foreword to the English-language edition of his memoir, published shortly before his death, Misch wrote that it was a different reality then, and he never asked questions during what he considered just his regular day at work. This willful incuriosity, this determination to focus on technical duties while ignoring the larger context, enabled the Nazi system to function. Evil regimes require not just fanatics, but also technicians, people who will answer the phones and manage the schedules and perform the small tasks that keep the machinery of state running. Misch was such a technician, and his insistence decades later that he was merely doing his job reflects a fundamental failure to grapple with what that job meant. By early 1945, the war was obviously lost. Soviet forces were advancing from the east, Western allies from the west. German cities were being reduced to rubble. The military situation was hopeless. Yet Hitler refused to leave Berlin, and Misch followed him down into the Führer bunker. The bunker complex, located beneath the Reich Chancellery Garden, consisted of 2 levels, the Vorbunker, upper level, and the Führer bunker proper, lower level. The lower bunker, where Hitler lived and died, was tiny. Individual rooms measuring only 10 or 12 square meters, far too small for comfort. It was no bunker to live in, Misch recalled. It was an air raid bunker. The concrete walls and ceiling were heavily reinforced against bombing, but they also created what Misch called a coffin of concrete, a claustrophobic tomb where the final act of the Third Reich would play out. In the last 8 to 10 days of Hitler's life, Misch and his comrade Johannes Henschel were often the only support staff remaining. Henschel ran the lights, air, and water, and I did the telephones. There was nobody else. When visitors came down the narrow stairs into the bunker, there weren't even enough chairs to offer them seats. The space was cramped, dark, and oppressive. Soviet artillery bombardment shook the bunker regularly. Dust fell from the ceiling. The air was stale despite ventilation systems. Everyone knew the end was approaching, yet they remained at their posts, following orders and routines, even as everything collapsed around them. On April 22, 1945, Hitler suffered what witnesses described as a complete breakdown. He declared that the war was lost and told his staff that everyone could go. Most of the bunker personnel evacuated to Berchtesgaden or tried to escape Berlin. But Misch stayed. His duty was to operate the switchboard, and he remained at his post. On April 28, he saw something unusual. Propaganda Minister Joseph Goebbels and Hitler's secretary Martin Bormann entered the bunker. He asked who it was, and they said, "That's the civil magistrate who has come to perform Hitler's marriage." That night, Hitler and Eva Braun were married in a brief ceremony. Misch monitored the switchboard as the wedding took place, another surreal moment in the bunker's final days. 2 days later, on April 30, Misch was at his station in the telephone operator's room when he saw Goebbels and Bormann talking with Hitler and his adjutant, SS Major Otto Gunsche, in the corridor outside. "I saw him go into his room," he said, "and someone, Gunsche, said that he shouldn't be disturbed, and that meant, now it's happening." Misch knew what was coming. Hitler had told his staff he would not leave Berlin alive. He would not be captured by the Soviets. He would die on his own terms. "We all knew that it was happening," Misch said. He said he wasn't going to leave Berlin. He would stay here. Misch heard no gunshot. The bunker's concrete walls were too thick, or perhaps he was too far away. But within minutes, the word spread. Hitler and Eva Braun were dead by suicide. Misch remained at his post, continuing to operate the switchboard because that was his duty. Later, Hitler's valet, Heinz Linge, came to Misch. He said, "The boss is being burned. Come on out." Misch refused. He believed the Gestapo officers he'd seen upstairs in the Reich Chancellery might want to kill the bunker staff as witnesses to what had happened. He said, "I saw the Gestapo upstairs in the Chancellery, and it could be that they'll want to kill us as witnesses." So he retreated deeper into the bunker.
But he did see Hitler's body being carried out. "They walked by me, about 3 or 4 meters away," Misch told the AP in 2005. "I saw his shoes sticking outside the sack. It was a mundane detail, shoes protruding from a blanket, that somehow made the moment real." The man Misch had served for 5 years, the man who had dominated Europe and plunged the world into catastrophic war, was reduced to a corpse in a sack, shoes visible, being carried upstairs to be burned in a shell crater in the Reich Chancellery garden. Misch watched them pass, then returned to his switchboard. There were still phones to answer. Misch remained in the bunker for 2 more days, now taking orders from Joseph Goebbels, who had become the new boss after Hitler's death. The atmosphere was surreal. Berlin was falling. Soviet soldiers were fighting street by street toward the Reich Chancellery. Artillery fire was constant, yet Misch sat at his switchboard in the concrete tomb, routing calls, performing his technical duties because that was what he knew how to do. On May 1st, Goebbels poisoned his 6 children and then committed suicide with his wife, Magda. On May 2nd, Goebbels came down to Misch one final time. He came down and said, "You have a chance to live. You don't have to stay here and die," Misch remembered. Finally, Misch was released from his post. He grabbed the rucksack he had packed and fled the bunker with a few others, emerging into the devastation of Berlin. He worked his way through cellars and subways, trying to avoid Soviet patrols. At one point, hearing German voices through an air ventilation shaft, he surfaced, hoping to find friendly forces. Instead, he found about 300 German soldiers who had already been taken prisoner. Soviet guards grabbed Misch as well. His war was over. His imprisonment was just beginning. Misch spent 9 years in Soviet prisoner of war camps, enduring harsh conditions and interrogation. The Soviets were intensely interested in anyone who had been in Hitler's bunker. They wanted every detail about Hitler's final days, about who had been present, about what had been said and done. Misch was interrogated repeatedly, his testimony recorded and compared with that of other survivors. He was eventually released in 1954 and allowed to return to Berlin, where he moved into a house in the working-class district of Rudow. He would live in that same house for the rest of his life, a deliberate choice to maintain continuity with his past. For decades, Misch lived quietly, working as a painter and decorator, returning to the trade his grandfather had forced him to learn. He married Gerda, the woman he'd met before the war, and they had a daughter, Brigitte. Life went on. Berlin rebuilt around him. Germany was divided, then reunified. The world changed dramatically, but Misch remained in his small house, living with his memories of 5 years spent in Hitler's shadow. He received visitors who wanted to speak with one of the last surviving witnesses to Hitler's final days. He gave occasional interviews, and in 2008, with help from writer Burkhard Nachtigall, he published his memoir. Der letzte Zeuge became an international sensation. It was translated into multiple languages, published in France, Japan, Spain, Poland, Turkey, and eventually in English in 2014 as Hitler's Last Witness. The book offered something rare, a first-hand account of daily life in Hitler's inner circle from someone who had been there but was not a major historical figure himself. Misch had no political theories to advance, no justifications to make for policy decisions. He simply described what he had seen and experienced as Hitler's bodyguard, telephone operator, and constant companion. The book was full of small details, the kind of details only someone who lived the experience would know. What Hitler ate for breakfast, how he spent his evenings, the routines of life at the Berghof, the atmosphere in the bunker during the final days. Critics noted that Misch glorifies nothing, criticizes nothing, and justifies nothing, not even himself, as one reviewer wrote. He presented his experience matter-of-factly, without attempting to distance himself from his service to Hitler or claim he had been secretly opposed to the regime. This honesty about his lack of opposition made the book both valuable as a historical document and troubling as a moral statement. Misch never apologized for his service to Hitler. He never expressed remorse for his role, however small, in the Nazi system. He maintained until his death that Hitler was no brute, no monster, no Superman, just a man, an employer, the boss. This perspective enraged some and fascinated others. Holocaust survivors and their descendants understandably found Misch's continued loyalty to Hitler obscene. How could someone who had served the architect of genocide speak of him affectionately? How could Misch claim ignorance when he had been present in the inner circle for 5 years? Critics accused him of moral blindness, of refusing even decades later to confront what he had been a part of. But historians recognize the value of Misch's testimony precisely because it was unfiltered by post-war guilt. Misch represented the perspective of the ordinary Germans who had enabled the Nazi system, not enthusiastically, not ideologically, but through competent service and willful incuriosity about the larger implications of their work.
Misch served as a consultant on films about Hitler's final days, including the 2008 Hollywood film Valkyrie about the July 20th, 1944 assassination attempt. He compared film portrayals to his memories and generally found them accurate on major facts, while exaggerated for drama. He noted that the 2004 German film Downfall was Americanized, and that people in the bunker had spoken more quietly than the film's actors shouted. These small corrections demonstrated his sharp memory for detail even 70 decades after the events. In his final years, Misch received a steady stream of visitors to his Berlin home. Journalists, historians, World War II enthusiasts, and the simply curious came to speak with one of the last living witnesses to Hitler's final hours. Misch, even in his 90s, maintained the rigid posture, broad shoulders, and military bearing of his SS days. He kept his white hair neatly combed. He cut the image of an SS man to the end, never quite leaving behind the identity that had defined the most significant period of his life. When asked about guilt and responsibility, he deflected. He had been a telephone operator, a bodyguard. What did he know about policy? What could he have done differently? He was just doing his job. This refrain, "just doing my job," echoes across generations of Germans trying to explain their role in the Nazi regime. It's the defense of the functionary, the technician, the person who kept the system running without taking responsibility for what the system did. Misch genuinely seemed to believe he bore no guilt because he had committed no crimes personally. He hadn't killed anyone, possibly except in combat as a soldier. He hadn't worked in concentration camps. He'd answered phones and tasted food and protected Hitler physically. That these tasks supported and enabled a regime that murdered millions didn't seem to register with him, or if it did, he never acknowledged it publicly. Misch died on September 5, 2013, at age 96, after a short illness. Obituaries around the world noted his passing as the end of an era. The last remaining witness to Hitler's final days in the bunker had died. But the obituaries also grappled with how to remember him. Was he a valuable historical witness whose testimony preserved details that might otherwise have been lost, or was he an unrepentant Nazi who had shown loyalty to evil until his final breath? The answer, uncomfortably, is both. Misch's testimony about Hitler's daily life and final days is historically valuable. His descriptions of the bunker, his accounts of specific conversations and events, his memories of who was present when, all of this provides historians with primary source material that helps reconstruct those final weeks of the Third Reich. But Misch's continued admiration for Hitler, his refusal to acknowledge moral complexity or personal culpability, his insistence that the boss was a wonderful employer, this reflects a profound moral failure that cannot be separated from his historical value. Misch lived till 2013, long enough to see Germany reunited, the European Union formed, and the world transformed beyond recognition from the one he'd known in Hitler's bunker. But in fundamental ways, he never left that concrete tomb beneath Berlin. He remained, until his final day, the loyal bodyguard, the efficient telephone operator, the man who called Hitler the boss and meant it as a compliment. His story is not heroic or redemptive. It's simply human, and that's what makes it so disturbing.